although our Data Futures project with HESA should hopefully address this issue, and in future we will be able to disaggregate students with multiple impairments and the various disabilities that they have. I know that the recording started as well, so that's good news. So I'll just talk a bit about the measures that we looked at in our data analysis. So this is what at the OFS we called the student life cycle. And it kind of tracks the chronology of a student from entering into higher education to how they progress afterwards. And they're kind of various measures that we have data on. So the first is access. And in this context, what we're looking at is the proportion of students entering higher education who have a reported mental health condition. We then look at continuation. So this is the proportion who continue into their second year of study. And we make a comparison between those with a mental health condition and all students. For attainment, this is the proportion of qualifiers who achieve a first or 2-1 degree. And again, we make a comparison between those with a reported mental health condition and all qualifiers. Finally, we have progression, which is the proportion of graduates in highly skilled employment or higher level study 6 months after graduation. This is drawn from survey data, so the Destination of Leavers from Higher Education survey, which at the time, because it's since been discontinued, had response rates of around 60%. So the coverage was very good, but of course it's not as complete as some of the other measures, so worth bearing that in mind as well. So I'll just talk you through some of the key findings now, but I would of course encourage you to read the report if you haven't done so already. There is a link in these slides which will be shared afterwards. So I'll start with access. And this is really looking at the makeup of students in entering higher education. So we found that the proportion of entrants reporting mental health conditions had been rising from 1.4% in 2012 to 3.5% in 2017. Although, as I mentioned earlier, it's unclear whether that might simply be reflecting a change in reporting practice. We found that full-time and part-time students were roughly equally likely to report having a mental health condition, so around 3.5%, which is actually in contrast to other disabilities for part-time students, which tend to be slightly more prevalent than for full-time students. And finally, we saw very substantial differences by sex, ethnicity, and deprivation. I'll show you a couple of charts now which give you an idea of some of those differences. So this is by ethnicity for full-time students. You can see that students of mixed ethnicity were most likely to report having a mental health condition, and Asian students were least likely. And this is the difference by sex. So female students were more likely to report having a mental health condition than male students. The proportion's over double. And it's actually worth noting that this kind of reflects the proportion that is seen in the wider population as well. So with kind of increased reporting amongst females. So to move on to continuation, so this is where we're looking at not just kind of the various proportions of reporting mental health conditions, but how they experience and succeed in higher education. So continuation rates we found were substantially lower for both full-time and part-time students with a reported mental health condition compared to the whole sector. Although we did find that this gap had roughly halved over the period that we were looking at. We found that Black full-time students with a reported mental health condition were roughly 8 percentage points more likely to drop out than all Black full-time students, which is a very substantial gap. And we found that the gaps were changing at different rates for male and female students. So here, this is the chart for ethnicity, and you can see the yellow bar showing that the gap for Black full-time students is the largest of any group. But in all cases, for all ethnicity groups, students with a reported mental health condition were more likely to drop out when compared to the whole sector. And these are the gaps for male and female students between those with a reported mental health condition and all students. You'll know that for male students, it's ticked upwards towards the end of the period, whereas for female students, it has been declining over the whole period. So now we'll look at attainment, and if you recall, this is the proportion of qualifiers achieving a first or 2-1 degree. We actually found that this was only marginally lower amongst those with a reported mental health condition when compared to all qualifiers, but we did find substantial differences by sex and ethnicity again. So again, Black full-time students had the largest attainment gap of any ethnicity group of around 6 percentage points. And male students were also roughly 4 percentage points less likely to achieve a first or 2-1 if they reported having a mental health condition. And that's what these charts are showing you here. And in fact, you can also note that for all Black students, the attainment rates are already lower. And obviously that's a separate issue, but it appears to be compounded by that group having reported mental health conditions as well. And this is the gap by sex, which you can see is kind of substantially larger for male students. And this is the final measure to look at. So progression being the proportion of graduates in highly skilled employment or higher level study 6 months after graduation. We found that full-time students were 4 percentage points less likely to enter into skilled work or higher level study if they reported having a mental health condition. But we did find that that gap had fallen over the period. And again, we found differences by ethnicity and this time economic deprivation, with the largest gap found for the most deprived graduates and also white graduates in this case, but that was closely followed by Black graduates again. So this is the percentage point gap for mature students, in fact, and you'll note that that's fallen substantially over the period as well. And this is the chart for ethnicity, which shows that gap in progression rates for Black students being the second largest after white students. So just to kind of reflect a little on the research and kind of actually the process of how it was for me contributing to it. So I think in hindsight, the comparison of students with a reported mental health condition with all students wasn't the most intuitive necessarily. And what we do elsewhere at the OFS and is kind of our default approach is to compare students with a characteristic with those without it. And that's kind of better statistical practice anyway. So I think in hindsight, it would have been better to do that. You might have also noted that the charts made the gaps appear small. So what we were trying to do with the charts was keep a kind of consistent axis from 0 to 100, which you could argue is more transparent. But you could also say that, you know, when you're looking at rates which are within a boundary of kind of 10 percentage points, it's quite hard to see the gaps there. So potentially we might have considered changing the axes on them as well. I mentioned earlier that this was one of the first projects I did at the OFS, and at the time my programming experience was very limited, and that meant that I created these charts in Excel, and that meant there was quite an increased burden later on in the day when we made small changes to the methodology. So whereas now I would much prefer to automate that process, it did put a bit of burden on us. And then finally, I think just one positive thing about it being my first project at the time was that I engaged quite critically with the data definitions, and you'll know I spent a lot of time on the caveats at the start of this presentation. I think if I weren't so new to it all at the time, I probably wouldn't have engaged so critically with it and then kind of interrogated exactly what the data was telling us and what it wasn't telling us. So that was possibly one positive thing. And just before I sort of open up to any questions, I want to talk a little bit about further research that the Office for Students is planning in this area. So today we looked at kind of actual observed gaps in outcomes between different groups of students. We have in the past, and we are continuing to look into using statistical modelling, so logistic regression in this case, to estimate the same gaps, but after controlling for other underlying differences between student groups. I'm sure this is an issue as researchers that many of you are familiar with, but obviously underlying differences can obscure what the true gaps are for different student groups. So for example, I've got here that if female students are more likely to study maths, and if maths students are more likely to continue with their studies, then some of the gap between male and female students in continuation rates might just be reflecting the fact that if you study maths, you're more likely to continue. And so what statistical modelling should allow us to do is control for those underlying differences insofar as we can actually observe them. Of course, it's still possible that there are things we can't observe and can't control for, and then that raises the possibility of there still being statistical bias. But it certainly should get us closer to the true answer, as it were. So actually, I think that's probably all I want to talk you through. I'm sure there might be some questions. I do kind of have various bits of detail on policy landscape and things like that I can talk about, although obviously my area of expertise is much more in the analysis itself. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd be very happy to take any questions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stanley. That was really, really interesting. We're going to open up the floor to questions. And Amy, I've noticed that you've just put your hand up. So would you like to come in first?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks so much, Stanley. So my PhD is looking at disclosure. So I'm quite familiar with sort of the OFS's insight briefs and the report and some of the sort of caveats that you mentioned. I suppose I was just wondering, sort of moving forward, what do you think would be the best way to address some of the issues, such as the rigidity of the HESA categories, so students who may use a wheelchair and have mental health difficulties being sort of grouped into the 2 or more conditions. So what do you think in terms of improving the quality of the data that we can collect? Just any thoughts on that would be great.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. That's a really important area, and it's definitely a vulnerability of this analysis. So as I mentioned, what I understand is that the data futures project that the OFS is commissioning HESA to carry out will hopefully address this issue. So the way that the data will be collected is such that a student with multiple impairments won't be asked to kind of lump them all into one category, but instead we'll be able to say what those various impairments are. And in that case, we should even be able to see how they might be interacting with one another, and not just kind of treated all as one issue. So the team that I work in doesn't particularly deal with data definitions and data assurance so much, but that is kind of my relatively limited understanding of it.
Thank you for your question, Amy. That's brilliant. And I'm going to come over to you, Katie, next, as you have your hand up.
Hi there, thanks so much. It's very interesting. I was really interested to read your report because I did this kind of analysis at university level years ago and ran logistic and also linear regression, looking at these sorts of outcomes and controlling for things. And obviously dealing with this nightmare messy data, I'm intrigued. Particularly when controlling for deprivation. There were lots of gaps and lots of debate when I spoke with academics about how I should handle the polar data. And also looked into what we could gather from free school meals and things like that. And I'm just really interested to hear how you think going forward you can understand how to use that data and maybe other indicators to help us really reach out to students and work effectively with them.
Yeah, definitely. So we work quite closely with our colleagues in access and participation regulation. And one of the things that they tell us quite consistently is that when we're able to control for underlying differences, it really helps them target their interventions. And so you're able to sort of much more easily pinpoint exactly what the drivers are that are, preventing certain students from either accessing or succeeding in higher education. as I mentioned, we are currently carrying out work to control for these various other characteristics that you've mentioned. All of them, in fact, are under consideration as potential factors. I think the way in which we're doing it, it's kind of about treating similar measures as it kind of in the same basket of things that you might want to control for at once. So where it's about the area that a student grew up in, so obviously that's things like POLAR and IMD, we might want to group those factors together and control for them all at once. On the other hand, things about their socioeconomic background, so like free school meals eligibility, you might want to consider that in conjunction with other measures of deprivation. So yeah, no, I basically definitely agree that it's a really important thing to do, because whenever you look at an observed gap, the truth is that under the surface it will definitely be hiding a lot of relationships which will contribute to it, and for policymakers it's not the easiest thing to just interpret that and target an intervention on the basis of a raw gap. So hopefully in future we will have some published analysis which will help our policymakers and other people in the sector target those interventions accordingly. Has that answered your question? Is
yeah, no, it's really interesting. I mean, I think so. Some of the academics, I went to speak with some of the academics about handling this, who'd sort of done research in these areas as well themselves. And I think there was some real debate about particularly using postcode data when you're in a big city. So, for example, somebody in London might actually be in quite an affluent postcode, but actually that may not reflect their lived experience. So it was just sort of thinking about what other measures can be sort of take that into account. That was one thing, and I'm just interested to hear how you're wrestling with that. I completely agree with thinking about it at the subject level. I found that when I looked at that, when I had sufficient numbers and control for those variables, we could really understand different patterns within different disciplines, and that really helped for tailoring proactive interventions to work with students and staff together when we were sort of thinking about multiple, because a person is not one thing, we're complex beings, so actually taking that into account. So it's really interesting, and it's very exciting to hear that you're really wrestling with this on a bigger level, really.
No, so all I'd add to that is that we definitely recognise the issues around area-based measures, in that the level of geography can often hide the fact that there are differences within a postcode or within a middle super output area and that sort of thing, and in those cases we're actually quite blessed with the availability of other data sources and other measures. So I mentioned free school meals eligibility as an example. We also share data with the student loans company, who give us household residual income data. So that's another potential indicator of socioeconomic background. So where there are kind of those issues in area-based measures, we can hopefully turn to other measures. I've forgotten this second part that you mentioned there.
Just thinking about subject specialisms. I think that's brilliant that you're going to be doing that, I think.
Great. So and subject is another thing that we would look to be controlling for in any kind of future update to this sort of analysis. So definitely recognise that subject level differences in particular probably help policymakers most, because I think research has shown that the gaps are quite big when you look across subjects, and they can vary quite a lot. So thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. No, I mean, I've definitely I've drawn from this particular work that you did, so I really thank you for doing it. It's been helpful, and look forward to seeing what comes out next. Thanks.
Thank you, Katie. Does anyone else have any questions for Stanley at all at this point? Julia?
This question is around, what is my question? Okay, so you have every year the like increasing disclosure. Let me just see if I can turn my camera on. I'm in an office and I'm not used to being in an office anymore, so I'm very confused by this. Okay, fine. So the rates of like disclosure when it comes to mental health are rising, right? Like every year it seems like it's rising with this particular question, but it's like so different than the percentage and the statistics that we see that are like thrown around by the NUS about like how many students are experiencing mental health difficulties. I've always thought that like, does it have something to do with it being under disability, like in this particular form? I guess I'm just like wondering what you think about the disparities in numbers with these numbers, even though they're rising. And like from my perspective, I always have thought that's a good thing, that more students are sharing. But then it's so different than like what statistics seem to be with like how many students are actually experiencing mental health difficulties, right? So, and I know there's like a whole thing about like when you're in university, maybe you start to experience them, and there's a lot of other things. I'm just interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, definitely. So I think, I mean, first of all, I should say that much of this is kind of fairly speculative, and there are other teams at the OFS who are kind of closer to data collection and would know a bit more about this than I do, kind of as the end user of it. But my understanding is that, yeah, because of the caveats I mentioned at the start, we are only probably scratching the surface here, and especially the framing of the way this information is collected under disability. Lots of students just won't recognise that I have a mental health condition and would report it in that way. And so when you're comparing to other data sources, it might be that the framing is much more about kind of broader well-being, and so is more likely to pick up where students have suffered with their mental health in the past, which is obviously a distinct kind of concept to this. And also, just again to touch on the fact that we're not sure the extent to which providers are updating the information within year. And I think, I mean, just from personal experience as well, and an anecdotal experience, we know that often students will develop mental health problems and conditions whilst they're at university, and so that may explain some of it too. But without concrete data on any of it, it is ultimately speculation. But I agree, it's definitely an issue with the data.
Do you think, sorry, can I ask a follow-up question? Do you think they're going to like change the wording so it sits in a different place? Or like, is that on the cards? Because I think it's like a little bit flawed. Like there's a lot of things with it, right? But
no, that's an interesting question. Unfortunately, I don't know. I would, but I will kind of feed that forwards, because as I said, with data futures, a lot of the data definitions have kind of been consulted on recently, and I'm sure I'm aware that they do consult with various stakeholders who kind of, I think Advanced HE being one example, various bodies which will have views about how the data should be collected. So yeah, I can pass that forward, and I'd be interested to know myself, so I'll look into that.
Yeah, it'd be really cool to talk to students about what language we should be using.
Yeah.
Definitely. I'm going to stop talking now. I always do.
Thank you, Julia.
Amy, you've got your hand up. Do you want to follow up on that?
Yeah, so not to sort of step on toes or anything, but the whole discussion that's just been had around sort of language and also around like discrepancies in disclosure rate is sort of my like mastermind specialist subject as such. Right. So the systematic review that I did looking at rates of both formal and informal disclosure within various student populations, one of the things that came out clearly was when students are filling out their UCAS forms or, registering for their university and they're being asked questions about sort of disability, mental health, wherever the university positions mental health within their sort of EDI type questions, students don't know what's going to happen to that information. Students don't feel like the universities or UCAS communicate effectively enough where that information is going to go. And I think that's one of the key reasons why there is this disparity between when the NUS says, here's this anonymous survey, and students can go, okay, this isn't going to get back to my supervisor, this isn't going to go on my sort of personal record, this isn't going to follow me out of university, compared to when universities ask, without necessarily giving students all of the information that they need to understand the implications of clicking, yes, I have like a mental health condition or disability, versus not. I think there's a real point to be considered when we're looking at research findings around student mental health and the changes in prevalence rates estimates on, was the survey set up to be anonymous, or was the survey conducted as part of an institution in a way that students might have felt that they could potentially be identified, because it is something you see across all the students, regardless of sort of general other population characteristics. So, for example, the numbers in terms of PGRs who disclose is about 0.7, but when you have in sort of the formal HESA numbers, but when you have anonymous surveys, that goes between 17 to 43%. I think there was a very good report, if you're interested at all, Julia, by the Higher Education Policy Institute called, I think it was called Students or Data Subjects, where it goes into a lot more detail about this and how universities, UCAS, etc., often don't provide students with enough information to make informed decisions about disclosure, not even just of mental health, but things of students being like, well, are they going to use the fact that I came from a school that I had free school meals? Are they going to use the fact that I come from a minoritized background as a sort of EDI point to show off how great they are, or why do they actually want this information? So I think there's a lot of lacking communication about what happens to data that students provide, and I think that's a clear, in my view anyway, from the systematic review I did, that's a clear reason why we have these disparities. Students feel like they want to have control over what is quite a personal piece of information, and when they're not provided with the resources and knowledge to allow them to make an informed decision around disclosure, they will just not. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble.
That was really helpful for me. Yeah, and I suppose I didn't mention it, and yeah, really good point. I definitely agree, Amy. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Amy. As you said, you are mastermind in this area, so your expertise is really valued and welcomed in this discussion. Does anyone else have any questions for Stanley at all, or would like to come in on that off the back of that conversation? If not, I have one kind of question. I know quite a lot of the findings that you mentioned related back to ethnicity as well, and the kind of gaps between white students and black students in particular. What are your thoughts around that kind of reporting as well? Because I know there's quite a lot of conversation around, do we need to dig deeper in terms of ethnicity and kind of unpick actually Black Caribbean students, Black African students and that kind of thing, but also what in terms of ethnicity, what does the Office for Students intend to do in terms of looking at that kind of intersectionality between ethnicity and socioeconomic status and mental health difficulties? Just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, or what the kind of future plans are around that.
Yeah, so even since this report a couple of years ago, we've definitely recognised that need to disaggregate ethnicity information further, and we've done so with our access and participation dashboard, and our equality and diversity statistics now kind of use the full 15 groups that are available within the data that we collect. And you do see very, very different patterns across different measures within that. So it's really important that we do look at disaggregated data where we can. I think sometimes the nature of that is that with the smaller groups, there's kind of less statistical certainty, or especially when we're modelling with smaller groups, it can be really difficult. So that is potentially one barrier, but at least it doesn't kind of hide anything which can be hidden when we aggregate ethnicity in this way. In terms of in future, I mean, I know that we've already looked at intersections between characteristics on our access and participation dashboard. I think free school meals eligibility is crossed with at least one characteristic. It might not be ethnicity, but we're certainly looking into where the granularity allows for it, and you know, where the groups aren't too small, we would like to be transparent and publish as much as possible. I should also point out that if people aren't familiar with our associations between characteristics of students measures, which are the shorthand for which is ABCs. And so what this does is it takes 6 student characteristics and looks at how they interplay with one another to kind of contribute to measures of access and continuation. And so we have some really useful web pages and dashboards where you can kind of go look at the intersection between 2 characteristics and see kind of what the results are in terms of how likely people are to go into HE, or how likely they are to continue with their studies given those 2 characteristics. So alongside the slides to this, I'll share the link to the ABCs analysis that we've got as well.
That'll be brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Danny. No, it's really interesting to see kind of what the future holds in terms of data analysis. And as Amy's put in the chat, as someone who is about to embark on a number of multivariate regression analysis, she wishes you lots of luck.
Thank you very much.
I think we can all relate to that.
Yeah.